The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rolling hills of Eldoria. Sir Alaric of House Vane, a knight of unwavering loyalty and unyielding resolve, stood at the edge of the forest, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant cries of birds. Alaric's armour, though worn and battered from years of service, gleamed faintly in the fading light. His journey had brought him here, to the edge of the unknown, where the fate of the kingdom, and perhaps his own soul, hung in the balance. Alaric's story was one of both triumph and tragedy. Born into a noble family, he had been trained from a young age in the art of combat and the code of chivalry. His father, Lord Cedric Vane, was a renowned warrior who had fought in the Great War of the Realms, and his mother, Lady Alara, was a healer known for her compassion and wisdom. Alaric had grown up hearing tales of heroism and honour, and he had vowed to follow in his father's footsteps, but fate had other plans. When Alaric was just 16, a band of marauders attacked his family's estate. His parents were slain, and the estate was reduced to ashes. Alaric, the sole survivor, was left with nothing but his sword and the weight of his grief. He swore vengeance on those who had taken everything from him, and for years he wandered the land, hunting down the marauders one by one. His quest for revenge consumed him, turning him into a shadow of the noble knight he had once aspired to be. Now, at the age of 30, Alaric had come to a crossroads. The last of the marauders had fallen by his blade, but the emptiness within him remained. He had no home, no family, and no purpose. It was then that he received a summons from King Edric of Eldoria, a call to arms that would change his life forever. Chapter 1. The Summons. The royal messenger arrived at the inn where Alaric had been staying, his face pale and his breath ragged from the long ride. He handed Alaric a sealed scroll bearing the king's insignia, a golden lion rampant on a field of crimson. Alaric broke the seal and read the message, his heart growing heavy with each word. The kingdom was in peril. A dark force had risen in the north, an ancient evil thought long vanquished. The Shadow King, a sorcerer of unimaginable power, had returned, and his armies of darkness were marching south, leaving destruction in their wake. Villages had been razed, crops burned, and innocent lives lost. The king's forces were stretched thin, and he needed every able-bodied knight to defend the realm. Alaric's first instinct was to refuse. He had no love for kings or kingdoms, and he had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. But something in the message stirred a long-forgotten sense of duty within him. He remembered the stories his father had told him, of knights who had fought not for glory or vengeance, but for the greater good. He thought of his mother, who had always believed in the power of compassion and redemption. With a heavy heart, Alaric packed his belongings and set out for the capital. The journey was long and arduous, but he pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. When he arrived at the castle, he was greeted by the sight of hundreds of knights and soldiers, all preparing for the coming battle. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of the impending war hung over everyone like a storm cloud. King Edric, a tall and imposing figure with a crown of silver and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, addressed the assembled knights. His voice was steady, but there was a note of desperation in his words. "The Shadow King is not merely a threat to our kingdom," he said. "He's a threat to all of humanity. If we do not stop him, the world as we know it will be consumed by darkness. I ask not for your loyalty, but for your courage. Stand with me, and together we will face this evil." Alaric felt a surge of determination. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had a purpose. He stepped forward and knelt before the king, his sword held out in front of him. "I pledge my sword to your cause, your majesty," he said. "I will fight for the kingdom and for the light." The king nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Rise, Sir Alaric. Your courage will not be forgotten." Chapter 2. The journey begins. The next morning, Alaric set out with a company of knights, their mission clear. to reach the northern stronghold of the Shadow King and destroy him before his armies could march south. The journey would take them through treacherous terrain, across raging rivers, and into the heart of enemy territory. It was a perilous task, but Alaric knew that failure was not an option. The first leg of their journey took them through the dense forests of Eldoria. The trees were ancient and towering, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of a distant animal. Alaric rode at the front of the column, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the knights began to feel a sense of unease. The forest seemed alive, as though it were watching them. The trees creaked and groaned, and the wind carried whispers that sent shivers down their spines. Alaric tried to shake off the feeling, but he couldn't help but feel as though they were being followed. Their fears were realised when they were ambushed by a group of shadow creatures, twisted, monstrous beings that seemed to materialise out of the darkness itself. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, their claws slashing through the air with deadly precision. The knights fought valiantly, but the creatures were relentless, and their numbers seemed endless. Alaric found himself face to face with one of the creatures, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. He swung his sword, but the creature dodged with ease, its movements almost fluid. Desperation fueled his strikes, and with a final, powerful blow, he managed to cleave the creature in two. It let out a piercing shriek before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. The battle was fierce, but the knights emerged victorious. Several of their number had fallen, and the survivors were battered and bruised. Alaric felt a pang of guilt as he looked at the fallen, their lifeless eyes staring up at the canopy above. He had led them into this danger, and he couldn't help but feel responsible for their deaths. As they buried their comrades, Alaric vowed to himself that he would not let their sacrifice be in vain. He would see this mission through to the end, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Trials of the Mountains. After days of travel, the knights reached the foothills of the Iron Peak Mountains, a range of jagged snow-capped peaks that marked the border between Eldoria and the Shadow King's domain. The mountains were treacherous with narrow paths that wound their way up the steep slopes, and the air grew colder with each step. The knights pressed on, their breath visible in the frigid air. The higher they climbed, the more difficult the terrain became. The paths were slick with ice, and the wind howled around them, threatening to knock them off balance. Alaric led the way, his determination unwavering despite the harsh conditions. As they ascended, they encountered a series of challenges that tested their resolve. The first was a narrow bridge that spanned a deep chasm, its wooden planks rotting and unstable. One misstep could send them plummeting to their deaths. Alaric was the first to cross, his heart pounding as he carefully placed each foot on the creaking planks. The bridge swayed dangerously, but he made it to the other side, and the rest of the knights followed. The second challenge came in the form of a massive avalanche that threatened to bury them alive. The ground shook as the snow and rocks tumbled down the mountainside, and the knights scrambled to find shelter. Alaric managed to lead them to a small cave just in time, the avalanche roaring past the entrance like a furious beast. The final challenge was the most daunting of all. As they neared the summit, they were confronted by a massive ice golem, a creature of pure frost and malice. The golem towered over them, its icy fist slamming into the ground with enough force to send shockwaves through the mountain. The knights attacked with everything they had, but their weapons seemed to have little effect on the creature's frozen form. Alaric realised that brute force alone would not be enough to defeat the golem. He remembered a tale his father had told him, of a knight who had faced a similar creature and had used fire to melt its icy heart. With a desperate plan in mind, Alaric grabbed a torch from one of the knights and charged at the golem, dodging its massive fists as he thrust the flame into its chest. The golem let out a deafening roar as the fire began to melt its icy form, Steam rose from its body as it thrashed wildly, but Alaric held firm, driving the torch deeper until the creature finally collapsed into a pool of water. The knights cheered, their spirits lifted by the victory, but Alaric knew that their journey was far from over. The Shadow King's stronghold lay just beyond the mountains, and the true battle was yet to come. Chapter 4. The Shadow King's Stronghold. The knights descended the other side of the mountains, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The landscape changed dramatically, the lush forests and snow-capped peaks giving way to a desolate wasteland. The ground was cracked and barren, the sky a dull, oppressive grey. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. In the distance they could see the Shadow King's stronghold, a massive fortress of black stone that seemed to rise out of the earth like a malevolent beast. The walls were lined with dark towers, and the air around the fortress shimmered with an unnatural energy. It was a place of pure evil, and Alaric felt a chill run down his spine as he gazed upon it. The knights approached the fortress cautiously, their weapons at the ready. As they drew closer, they were met by a horde of shadow creatures, their eyes glowing with malevolent light. The creatures charged at them with a ferocity that was almost overwhelming, and the knights were forced to fight for their lives. Alaric fought with everything he had, his sword cutting through the shadow creatures with deadly precision. But no matter how many he struck down, more seemed to take their place. The battle was fierce, and the knights were slowly being overwhelmed. Just as it seemed that all hope was lost, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman clad in armour of silver and gold, her sword glowing with a radiant light. She moved with a grace and skill that was almost otherworldly, her blade cutting through the shadow creatures with ease. The knights rallied at the sight of her, their spirits lifted by her presence. Together they managed to push back the shadow creatures and make their way to the fortress gates. The woman introduced herself as Lady Seraphina, a knight of the Order of the Dawn, an ancient order dedicated to fighting the forces of darkness. She had been sent by the king to aid them in their quest, and her arrival could not have come at a better time. With Lady Seraphina's help, the knights managed to breach the fortress gates and make their way inside. The interior of the fortress was a labyrinth of dark corridors and twisting passages, the air thick with the stench of decay. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the knights could feel the weight of the Shadow King's presence pressing down on them. As they ventured deeper into the fortress, they encountered more shadow creatures, each more powerful than the last. The battles were fierce, and the knights were pushed to their limits. But Alaric refused to give up. He had come too far to turn back now, and he knew that the fate of the kingdom, and perhaps the world, depended on their success. Chapter 5. The Heart of Darkness. The deeper Alaric and his companions ventured into the Shadow King's fortress, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of darkness. The knights moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready, their senses heightened by the ever-present threat of shadow creatures. Lady Seraphina, with her radiant sword and unwavering resolve, proved to be an invaluable ally. Her knowledge of the Shadow King's dark magic and her skill in combat were unmatched, and she fought with a grace that seemed almost divine. Alaric found himself drawn to her, not just as a fellow warrior, but as a kindred spirit. They shared a common purpose, and their bond grew stronger with each passing moment. As they pressed on, they encountered a series of traps and obstacles designed to thwart intruders. There were pits filled with venomous serpents, corridors lined with hidden blades, and chambers filled with illusions designed to prey on their deepest fears. Alaric's leadership and quick thinking helped them navigate these dangers, but the toll on their morale was evident. The knights were weary, their spirits weighed down by the relentless darkness. One particularly harrowing encounter took place in a chamber filled with mirrors. As they entered, the reflections of the knights began to move independently. stepping out of the mirrors to attack them. The mirrored doppelgangers were exact replicas of the knights, matching their every move and strike. The battle was chaotic, with each knight forced to confront a twisted version of themselves. Alaric found himself face to face with his own reflection, a dark and twisted version of himself. The doppelganger sneered at him, its eyes filled with malice. "You are nothing but a shadow of the knight you once aspired to be," it taunted. "Your quest for vengeance has consumed you, and now you are lost." The words struck a chord within Alaric, but he refused to be swayed. With a fierce cry, he lunged at his doppelganger, their swords clashing in a flurry of strikes. The battle was intense, but Alaric's determination and resolve proved stronger. With a final powerful blow, he shattered the mirror, and the doppelganger dissolved into shards of glass. The other knights, inspired by Alaric's victory, managed to defeat their own doppelgangers. The chamber fell silent, the mirrors now reflecting only the weary faces of the knights. They pressed on, their resolve strengthened by the trial they had overcome. Chapter 6. The Shadow King's Throne Room. At last they reached the heart of the fortress, a massive chamber lit by an eerie greenish light. The walls were adorned with grotesque carvings of twisted figures and malevolent creatures, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. In the centre of the chamber stood the Shadow King, a towering figure clad in armour of blackened steel. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The Shadow King turned to face them, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You have come far, Knights of Eldoria, but your journey ends here." Alaric stepped forward, his sword held high. "We will not let you destroy the kingdom. Your reign of terror ends today." The Shadow King laughed, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. "Foolish mortal, you cannot hope to defeat me." With that, the battle began. The Shadow King was a formidable opponent, his dark magic and immense strength making him a nearly unstoppable force. The knights fought valiantly, but they were no match for his power. One by one they fell, until only Alaric and Lady Seraphina remained. Alaric and Seraphina fought side by side, their swords flashing in the dim light. They managed to land a few blows on the Shadow King, but his wounds healed almost instantly, and he seemed to grow stronger with each attack. Desperation began to set in as they realised that they were fighting a losing battle. But then Alaric remembered something his mother had told him long ago. "The light of hope can pierce even the darkest shadows," she had said. "No matter how dire the situation, never give up." With renewed determination, Alaric focused all of his energy into a single powerful strike. His sword glowed with a radiant light as he drove it into the Shadow King's chest. The Shadow King let out a deafening roar as the light spread through his body, consuming him from within. His form began to dissolve, his dark magic unravelling as the light overwhelmed him. With a final anguished cry, the Shadow King was no more. The fortress began to collapse around them, the dark energy that had sustained it dissipating. Alaric and Seraphina barely managed to escape, the fortress crumbling into dust behind them. Chapter 7. The Return. The journey back to the capital was a sombre one. Many of the knights who had set out on the quest had not returned, and those who had were forever changed by the experience. Alaric felt a deep sense of loss, but also a glimmer of hope. The Shadow King was gone, and the kingdom was safe. When they arrived at the castle, they were greeted as heroes. King Edric himself came out to meet them, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You have done what many thought impossible," he said. "The kingdom owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Alaric knelt before the king, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had happened. "I only did what I believed was right, your majesty. The true heroes are those who gave their lives to protect the kingdom." The king placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. "You have proven yourself to be a true knight, Sir Alaric. Your courage and selflessness will not be forgotten." As the days passed, Alaric found himself reflecting on his journey. He had set out seeking redemption, and in the end, he had found it. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and peace. He knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new battles to fight, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face them. He had found his place in the world, and he would continue to fight for what was right no matter the cost. And so Sir Alaric of House Vane rode out once more, his sword at his side and his heart filled with hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew that as long as he stayed true to himself, he could overcome any obstacle. For he was a knight, and his journey was far from over,